In this episode of the Project Management Podcast, I'll show you how to make better decisions based on a well-researched model that can be applied personally and professionally.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. I'm Cornelius Fichtner. We are coming to you live from the invigorating 2017 PMI Global Conference in Chicago. And with me, sitting here in room 185A, is Andy Kaufman. Hello, Andy.
Hello, Cornelius. It's great to see you.
It is. This is the first time. How many years have we known each other?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's the first time we're meeting in person.
It's such a pleasure for me.
Yeah.
It is.
So the audience has just left. We are in a completely empty room.
Yeah.
But when I came in about 10 minutes before everything ended, this place was packed.
Yeah.
Literally from the angle where I was standing, I started counting empty seats.
Yeah.
I was able to count 4.
Is that right? Yeah.
They were sitting like sardines packed into here. Congratulations on a successful presentation at the Global Conference.
Yeah, it's an honor even to have a presentation selected for this sort of thing. There's great sessions all over the place, but this group in particular seemed hungry for, I need practical ideas, and I think that's true of the Congress. Don't give us theory.
Yeah.
Tell us how to do this.
Yeah.
And decision making, you and I are making choices all the time. All of our listeners are. So.
How was the energy for you up here as a presenter?
It was really good in that the last session of a day can sometimes be very difficult.
Yeah.
And because people have, just some of them traveled, so there's the time zone. So my goal into it was keep it very interactive. And so when they are talking, that usually adds some energy to it. And so it's a very interactive session. So it's fun.
You're the only one that stands between them and their martini, right?
Right. So get done early, too. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Your presentation is titled, How to Make Better Choices for You, Your Team, and Your Projects.
Yeah.
However, everything that I know about you screams leadership. How did you go from leadership to this topic? How to make better choices for you, your team, and your project? What's your interest here?
Yeah, it's a great point. A lot of times, there's a lot of different definitions of leadership, but one of them is, here's where we're aiming, this is where we're trying to go, and this is how we're going to get there. But it's not just some sort of sterile sort of, like, this is where we're going to go. There are decisions all along the way. And so I've had over 250 coaching clients, and one of the things I find is what they're looking for help sometimes is, I'm trying to decide, do I do this or do I do this? Career-wise, do I do this, do I do this? My team. So leaders are faced with decisions all the time. And so it was one of those areas that, to tell you quite frankly, Cornelius, I don't feel like I was born to be this unbelievably bold, confident leader. So our decision maker, I felt like I needed help. And so it's an area that I knew that people needed help. I needed help. And so that was kind of like, let's go off and research this and see if I can make better decisions as a result of it.
All right. Talk to me about a typical decision-making process. How does that work?
Yeah. So I start the discussion off with, so how do you do it? And inevitably, Cornelius, someone will go, pros and cons, And it's such a typical thing, but it's so weak, because like maybe they're 3 pros, and I really want those. And there's 3 cons, but one of them is death, or something. I mean, it doesn't weight them. It's not equal. And so it's often used, or sometimes people go, well, Cornelius, what I do is I analyze all the options and I weigh them. But the truth is, one guy even said it during the session today. He goes, I talk to everybody and then I do what I want to do myself. And I applauded. In fact, we as a group applauded him for his honesty, because we wouldn't say that or admit it, but sometimes that's what we do. So it's interesting. So those would be some typical ways. I think we fancy ourselves as more objective about it, but there's not a whole lot of research to back that up that we're objective. Yeah.
You had a few steps that you went through in your presentation there. You encounter a choice, you analyze your options, you make a choice, and then you live with the consequences.
Right.
How did you come up with those 4 sort of steps?
Yeah, I'd like to say it was brilliance on my part, but that was heavily informed by Chip and Dan Heath, and they've got a book called Decisive. And if anybody's looking for a good book on decision making, what I like about their book is it's well-researched, evidence-based, but very practical. Because there's a lot of textbook sort of stuff on decision-making like MBA sort of an analytical stuff, but when it comes to how do you do it, these guys, that was their model.
Okay.
Yeah. So
and is this, when you say, is this normally what we do when we make decisions?
That's a good
point. Is it what we should be doing?
It's what I would say we would like to think we do, except for the last step, prepare to be wrong. I think a lot of times we don't do that last step. We say it's the choice is obvious that we have to make one, and we think we analyze them, but there's some weaknesses to how we do it. We make the choice, that's pretty obvious, but that last step of prepare to be wrong is one of the things that's easy to miss.
You also talked about the villains of decision-making. Who are they, or what are they?
Yeah. So the first one is just narrow framing. It's just that we don't look at enough options. We don't look at enough options. There are more options out there than what we have. And there's things like short-term emotion, that we just get too swayed by the emotion of the moment and we react instead of we respond. There's overconfidence. I made a bad decision because I was overconfident. So those would be examples of some of the things that get in the way.
Which one is your personal nemesis out of those?
I have a friend who had a Facebook post this last week. He goes, "What do you know to be true, but have trouble believing?" And what I said was that I'm biased. I know that I am intellectually.
Yeah.
But in the moment, I would never say to you, Cornelius, I've looked at all the options, but I will not in the moment realize, I might be enough biased here that I ought to contact a couple friends and say, would you speak into this? So for me, and I've interviewed some people on biases that teach it, research it. One guy in particular, his name is Michael Roberto, former Harvard Business School professor. He goes, I've researched it, I teach it, I still succumb to it. It's almost like wired into us as humans is that bias, and it's so hard to get past. So that's me.
Okay. These four villains, if we can get rid of them, is this what will lead us to better decision making? If we can overcome
that's a
them?
great question, Cornelius, because as much as I'd like to say we can get rid of them, it's maybe just part of the human condition that we'll have the biases. Yeah. But so in some ways, I think of it from a project management perspective like a mitigation thing. So we recognize that we're limited in the options. So there's probably more options there than we think. So a way to mitigate that would be some techniques we talked about during the session. But even as you try to mitigate a risk in the workplace, on our projects, we can still have bias there. That this one, like even a mitigation strategy, we can come up with one mitigation strategy instead of 3 mitigation strategies and an active acceptance, some sort of contingency. We fall into the same trap. We don't come up with enough. So I like to think of it as anybody that tells you, I've got a process for you, Cornelius, that'll guarantee your decision is right, run. It's just not going to happen. But I think of it as a mitigation sort of thing with decisions. Yeah.
Okay. In the latter part of your discussion, you then went into each of these 4 steps that we just talked about. You encounter a choice, you analyze your options, you make a choice, and then you live with the consequences. Right. And you show us a better way of doing each of these, and they end up being a nice, lovely acronym which project managers love.
Is that the truth?
Walk us through this. So you encounter a choice. What do we need to do at this point?
So one of the big points that we talk about is a lot of times in life, it's can you recognize a trigger and what you normally do there, and then when that trigger happens, do something different. So it's kind of like the habit theory. And so one of the triggers to watch for is whenever any of us here, between the two of us or someone listening, says, I'm trying to decide whether or not to. The trigger is whether or not. Because what that phrase is saying is, well, there's just 2 options. And so the idea of mitigating narrow framing is come up with more options. Now, sometimes it feels like, for project managers, like we ship or we delay. So it feels like it's only 2 states.
We make it in-house or we buy it.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect example. That's even a better example. But do we have to outsource all of it, or could we do some of it? There's almost always more options. And so one of the triggers is whether or not. It's very practical, and it's very easy to say, I'm trying to decide whether or not I should stay with my company. Well, wait a minute. There's another option. Maybe I update my resume. Maybe I go to more PMI chapter meetings and network with people and find out that well, every company's screwed up, and so maybe, maybe. But the idea is that there are more options almost always. So whether or not is a phrase. Another thing we talked about with widen your options is it's called the vanishing options test. So an example is, let's say someone, in fact, this is a real life example. I'll call the guy Mark. He was looking for a job. He's a guy I'd hired. He'd left to go to somewhere else. He was in between jobs, and I said, I call him, Mark, how's it going? And he was trying to be upbeat. He goes, it's going pretty well, but his vocal tone was like, things aren't going well. And so what are your best options? And he talked about 2 of them. And so the vanishing options test says, let's pretend both of those go away. Not because we want them, but God forbid, they call you right after we get off the phone, and they both say, hey, you're not going to the next round of interviews. What would you do? And he got kind of quiet, but he goes, I think I'd go into consulting. And what's interesting about that is I'm like, well, Mark, why don't you look into consulting now? Now, he ended up in a consulting role. I'm not saying it's because of our conversation. Yeah. It might have just ended, in fact, for one of those might have been consulting for all I know. But the point is, you can you can sometimes generate a decision by saying, well, here are the options I'm thinking about. Let's say both of those went away. Then what would I do? And so that would be an example for the narrow framing.
Okay. So that was you encounter a choice, and what we need to do is to widen our options, and the first letter of the acronym, which we're not going to tell people yet. We're going to keep this a secret until the end. It's a W. Yes, we're keeping this a suspense, making sure that people are following us. So step number 2, you analyze your options.
Right.
How do we improve analyzing our options?
We're taught, although this might be more of a English-speaking country thing, but we're told all the time, don't assume. Because you know what the word assume is, right? Yeah. We're told, don't assume. But project managers, we know, charters always have assumptions.
Of course.
You have to have assumptions.
Have an assumptions log, for heaven's sake.
Exactly, yeah. So we know that we have to have them, but it's almost wired into us that assumptions are bad. Don't assume. But the thing is, the reason why people tell you don't assume, because you know what the word assume means, is that when assumptions turn out to be bad, people go, well, see, you assume. Don't assume. But we say that when assumptions turn out to be bad. But if it turned out to be good, that was brilliant planning.
Thank God you assumed.
Right. Or that was a good plan, they'll say.
Okay.
But we have this kind of mixed view of this. So when it comes to decisions, it's the same sort of thing. Say, listen, whether I realize it or not, I've got some assumptions. They're neither good nor bad. But what I need to do is to get some perspective on this. So I actually don't watch a whole lot of TV, but the undercover boss idea is easy to get without watching the show.
I like the show. There are sometimes even some project management and business-related things you can learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Other than you need the Kleenex at the end because it always ends the same way.
Right. So sometimes to validate the assumptions, it's kind of get out of the ivory tower, so to speak. And if it's a systems thing, talk to users. If it's construction, get out on the job site. It's to reality test these things, because I like this quote from John Galsworthy. He says, idealism increases in direct proportion to your distance from the problem. Think about it. I'm more idealistic the further away I am. Mm-hmm. So this is easy. We just replace that system with that system. It's like no big deal. But you talk to the people. I did this early in my career. We went up to these people in a doctor's office. We have software for doctor's offices. You can use a mouse now, and there's multiple windows, and we're like, this is going to be great. And they're like, but I can't hit Control V and all these different keystrokes. I don't want to use a mouse. Where'd the window go? I don't even know. So we didn't reality test our assumptions of how this was going to be good or bad, and so we ended up making some poor decisions on the rollout. So zoom in would be an example of one way to reality test it. Talk to other people that are doing things like this. This is kind of a silly example, but back in the early Intel days, they were trying to figure out, do we get out of memory chips and go into processors, or do we stay in memory chips? Now, you and I are old enough to know how much space it used to take for memory, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the price point gets lower and lower and lower, and that's what was going on in their business. At one point, Andy Grove and Gordon Moore say, how about this? If the board kicked us out and someone else came in, what would they decide? So if you and I, for one reason or another, lost our job, or we just decided to quit, or someone else comes in and runs your podcast or runs mine or does, and what decisions would they make that we're not making now? It can sometimes be a clarifying new perspective. They'd be like, why do we still have this product over here? Or why are we doing this? When so it's almost a version of, my wife says she can help other people clean out their closets, but she can't clean out her own. It's I can help somebody else. I can help a coaching client make a decision, but it's a little bit more difficult for me. So trying to reality test the assumptions. That's kind of the idea.
Okay. It sounds like a difficult step, though, because you really have to be willing to listen and to go, okay, here are my assumptions. Yeah. I believe these assumptions to be true, but now I have to literally go, no, they are not true. I have to prove that they are true.
Right. And that, let's face it. I mean, we're constrained with time. Yeah. So a lot of times it's going to be, this is a neat idea. But who's got the time to say, well, I'm going to go do an undercover boss, or I'm going to go and who needs more meetings with stakeholders, for goodness sake, right? So it feels like it's difficult. But one of the things we talked about there is, can you foster some, the academics will call it cognitive conflict, where let's say someone comes up and goes, like somebody on your team, and go, well, Cornelius, I think that email you send out, it could be taken the wrong way. It'd be confusing. And you might be like, what are you talking about? That's a brilliant email. I wrote that email. That's perfectly clear. But allowing the person to give you the feedback and say, well, if this one person thinks it's confusing, okay? So here's the deal. You'll appreciate this. I got an email about a month ago from someone who goes, Andy, I listen to all kinds of podcasts. Your voice is irritating.
I've gotten that one.
Well, no, you've got I love your accent. But he goes, your voice is irritating. I'm like, well, tell me, has it gotten more irritating, less irritating? Because I've changed some of my stuff. He goes, no, it's been irritating for years. And so everything inside me, you know what I wanted to say to him? What I wanted to say was, well, just don't listen.
Yeah, that's...
But if that one person finds something... And so one of the more recent episodes, I changed the post-processing. I didn't tell him. But then I actually got back to him and said, by the way, did you notice anything different in the last episode? He goes, yeah, it's better. I'm like, but he goes, he noticed it. And so I wonder how many times, not only you and I, in anything we do, but we're not listening to that one person that's out there that we take it as, well, what an idiot, or what I'm sure they had a poor childhood. we just discount it. But the reality test the assumptions is, well, if somebody out there thinks our software is difficult to use or our process documentation is not clear, we have so much ownership on this that it's easy for us to fall in love with it and miss the fact that when someone calls our baby ugly, it might really be ugly, but we're just too in love with it. So
all right, okay, so we have 2 steps and 2 letters in our acronym. You encounter a choice. You improve that by W. You widen your options. Mm-hmm. Step number 2, you analyze your options. Yeah. You improve that step by R. You reality test your assumptions. So we're at R in the acronym, right? And then you make a choice is the 3rd step. Yeah. So when you make a choice, you usually you make a choice and you go, okay, this is it. This is my decision. This is what. How can I improve that? Yeah.
So the big thing here is to get some distance from it. And so too often what happens is we react instead of
snap
respond.
decisions.
Exactly. The rough equivalent is when you get an email from somebody on the other side of the business and they called our baby ugly. Right? They didn't like the decision. They don't like something. They got upset in the meeting. What we want to do is just write them off right away, or we send the email. Go Alt S. That'll tell them. It's the social media post in the heat of the moment. It's the if you say in a meeting, I just got to say, whatever you say after that, you're just going to regret.
Yes.
And so Peter Bregman wrote this book called 4 Seconds, and his point is 4 seconds is about the length of time to take a really deep breath. Yeah. And just say, and he goes, it's just enough time for the prefrontal cortex to take over from the amygdala. And so it might still spill out of our lips, but from a decision, it's like, you know what? I think this is what we're going to do, but real quick, I'm going to sleep on this one. And sometimes we don't have the time, but almost always it might be, I'm going to take an extra hour and just attain some distance on this. Or one of the things we talked about in the class is Susie Welch's 10-10-10, which says, how would I feel about this 10 minutes from now? If I make this decision, how would I feel 10 minutes from now? How would I feel 10 months from now? How would I feel 10 years from now? I just can't even think about 10 years. It's hard to even imagine. But too often we make these short-term decisions and we don't think of a longer term. So that 10-10-10 is sometimes helpful. Like, how would I feel if I'm still doing this? Maybe what we do is we say 10 minutes, 10 weeks, 10 months.
Yeah.
Are 10 months from now, are we still tolerating the same project success rate because we're just unwilling to make some changes? And so even though it'll be painful 10 minutes after I announce this, people aren't going to like it. But if we think it through, we're not dealing with the same problems 10 months from now. So attain some distance, just like, I guess.
Go get a coffee.
Exactly.
That's all it
might
really
be a simple,
takes.
great
Just
point.
get up, walk away, get something to drink, come back. That distance is often enough for you to go, I'm glad I haven't sent that email, or I haven't called that person and told them what I really think.
I think, I don't know if you still do it once a year, but you go back over to Europe. And you just have some time away. I don't know if you do it, but every once in a while you do that. Sometimes
visiting my family.
Right, exactly. So sometimes I feel like if I just get away from my normal, sometimes it's clarifying when you're just away from it and just say, well, wait a minute. This is I've just been tolerating. I just need to take care of. So however you do it, just getting some distance from the heat.
Yeah, that helps. So we have the third letter, W-R-A.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We're getting to the fourth and final step,
the
and also the final letter. Yeah. The final step is you live with the consequences.
Yeah. Right.
That's normal, I've made the decision. I have to live with the consequences. How can I improve that? I mean, there's nothing.
Just feel like the ship has sailed.
Yeah,
right? There's nothing you
it's
can do.
done. I'm here. So how can I improve my decision-making process at that point?
Right.
What do I do?
So the best thing I found with this is to set a tripwire, which is kind of like a stop loss on a stock investment. So it's saying, all right, I'm going to invest in this, but if it either goes this high, I'm going to sell it. If it goes this low, exactly.
Yeah, you sell it too.
And so this might be one of those things of, all right, here's the deal. We're going to try something, but if by this point out here, and give yourself some time, that we have not achieved the efficiency gains that we're thinking, if we've still not delivered this thing by then, we kill the project. Or if we do not have the capital approval by this date, but we're going to do everything we can until then, but if we can't get the approval then, or if we've not sold a single client. I was asked to facilitate a lessons learned retrospective for a company, and beforehand I said a survey like, hey, was the project successful? In your mind, was it successful? To a person, everyone said in the survey, yes. When I got there, what I found out, they didn't sell a single copy of that software to anybody. Nobody bought it. But they still considered it to be successful. And so
the project may have been successful, but the sales numbers are.
Yeah, so it depends on that definition.
Successful completion.
But if we listen, what's the tripwire out there of we're going to make the decision to do this, but if we haven't achieved a certain thing by then, and an example in the session, we say somebody goes, I want to go to Argentina someday. But she was in her teenage years, couldn't afford it. She goes to college. After college, can't afford it. Gets married, can't afford it because there's kids. Can't afford it because of college. She gets too ill to travel.
Oh.
The question is, when did she decide not to go to Argentina? And I think if she's with us here, she'd go, I never decided that. But she decided every time around. So the point is, if I don't have a raise by a certain time here, or if I'm not leading projects full-time by here, set a tripwire. And then that's the thing it says, listen, I got to go and start looking for other opportunities. But this set a tripwire just says go all in until then, but let's not pretend it's a good decision if we haven't achieved that.
Now, you mentioned tripwire a few times, and our listeners are probably thinking, wait, tripwire, that turns into rat, W-R-A-T. That can't be the right letter. What is the letter?
Rat. That would be ironic. Dirty rat. It is a P. Prepare to be wrong. Yep.
Okay, and that brings the RAP acronym into this. Where does the acronym come from?
It comes from the Heath brothers. Yeah, in that book, Decisive. It's the and I just think it's brilliant, and I just think it's easy to remember. And I would say, in retrospect, Cornelius, what people tell me after the session is that they found each of the letters helpful. But if I run into them like 6 months afterwards, what they say is the single biggest thing they take away from it is the widen the options. Is there are more options out there.
Right.
And we just too easily, whether it's time constraints, whether it's fallen in love with an option. We just don't do enough of that. So if after listening to this podcast, people are like, well, was it rat? Was it rack? If they remember the W.
Widen your options.
Right. That would be enough to start benefiting them. Yep.
Okay, good. I started out talking about, I know you as being part of the leadership business.
Right.
So what is the role of the leader then in decision making? You even had an exercise with the attendees.
Right. Yeah, a lot of times, or most of what we talked about even here was us making better decisions. But it's interesting, as leaders, we can do things that get in the way of our teams making good decisions. Like, let's say you go up to one of the folks that are either editing an episode or they're helping you do something, and you go, all right, I think this will probably take about 2 days, but get back to me with however long you think it's going to take. Right. Whatever you said as the leader, you set an anchor there, and the odds of them going too far from that anchor. Right. So a leader can go, well, I think this is a great idea, Cornelius, but I want you to look into it. But the way that the leader says it, it's almost like showing that I'm not going to be open to it. So thinking about how, like, we cast a long shadow as leaders, and the way we react to when bad news comes tells our people, am I open to bad news? That's an example. So we can get in the way based on how we respond. So here's just one practical thing. Let's say someone comes up to a listener and goes, hey, listener is Sally. Sally, I don't think that's a good decision. What does Sally normally want to do? She wants to go, well, no, she wants to push back, gets defensive. But one of the things that Sally can do is say, you know what? You're exactly right. That is a concern. That concern. And, by the way, here are 2 or 3 more concerns that I've considered here. Even with those in mind, this is why we want to do it. But when we get super defensive on something, people see right through it. Or if nothing else, we're telling them, don't give me any contrarian feedback. So the way we respond when someone questions us. So in my example, when the guy's like, your voice is irritating, it's like, when I got back to him, I said, what do you think? He goes, man, thanks for listening. So, so do we set an anchor? Do we make it safe for someone to say, well, I'm not so sure that's good, and so we can have a conversation about it? It's really a call for humility there as leaders, that we don't have all the answers.
We already know that the one thing you wanted people to take with them when they left here and when we end the recording is the W, the widen your options. Right. Think about the many more options that you have. Yeah. It's not an A or B, it's an A and B and C and D and potentially all the way up to the end of the alphabet.
Depending on the situation, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what kind of questions did people come up to the podium then at the end?
Most of it was, I really enjoyed that. One was, like we talked about from a leadership perspective of, too often when it comes to status, if you use some sort of stoplight methodology of red, amber, green, or red, yellow, green, that a lot of teams are like, it's green. Everything's green. And so we talked about, as a leader, it's probably not all green. And we need to not just rely on the stoplight methodology. Ask more questions about it. A guy came up afterwards, Cornelius, and he goes, at our company, it's just the opposite. We assume that it's broken. That the culture in their company is, hey, I don't care what you say, it's broken. And so they have to go off and find ways to prove that here's where it's broken. And so it's almost like a cultural thing where it's assumed guilty. And you almost have to make sure that they can find something, because then they're happy if you say everything's okay. So think about that from a project management perspective. That's it's almost disheartening. I think you could be like, all right, I'm sure there's a problem here, and almost like you're trying to catch people doing things wrong or something like that. So he goes, it feels like it's negative. And so the thing I encourage him to think of is, instead of thinking in terms of broken or problems, think of it in terms of risks. And so instead of like, we got to find something broken, it's, well, what are our top risks? Risk doesn't mean someone made a mistake. Risk just means here's some uncertainty, and what are we doing about it? And so it wasn't necessarily even pure decision making as much as, he goes, when we show our status, that we have to go red. But I'm like, are you communicating the risks? Are you doing that? So anyway, that was kind of an interesting discussion point. So,
how would you recommend that our listeners apply what they have learned here, the acronym WARAP? Is this something that you do on your own? Is this something that you bring your team in? Is this something where you tell everybody, oh, you have to read this book first?
right.
Or listen to Andy's podcast?
Well, I'd say listen to this episode, Cornelius, and that can give you enough. I think for me, I guess one of the things I find, Cornelius, is the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And so it's kind of when someone is listening to us and they have a decision coming up, just realize there's so much about this decision that we don't know. So we go in with that bias. There's stuff we don't know. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's the problem often isn't that people are ignorant. It's the illusion of knowledge. And so it's usually not that we're stupid or the people around us are stupid. It's that we think we know. And so if we go into it and say, all right, I've got this decision to make, I'm going to talk to a couple extra people, get their perspective, and try to be open-minded to it. I'm going to try to force myself to come up with a third option and fall in love with at least two. So, which is to say, I could support at least two of those three options. That's just coming up with bogus options. Try to take a breath and making sure I'm not being overly impulsive about it. So maybe it's just slow down that decision just enough to get some other perspectives on it. It might just save us some big mistakes.
Wonderful. Andy, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
That's an honor, Cornelius. It is. Yep.